David Labaree. Thank you for accepting my invitation onto my podcast. First of all, there'll be a lot of people who are listening today who won't know you. And so I reckon this is a really good, interesting way to kind of start. I like to ask all my guests, how would you answer that question? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe a bit about your background, even better, how you ended up at Stanford? There are a lot of people out there who will be listening and he'll be wondering, how did you end up at Stanford University?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing about that. I ended up writing something about that one time because I got tired of Stanford students who seemed to feel that they deserved to be there, that this was their just dessert for a lifetime of being smart and hardworking. And nobody ever mentioned the elements of luck and birth and all these other things. And so I ended up writing a little piece about, my tour, because I started out teaching in a community college, which is the very bottom of the American system. Taught there for like 8 years, the whole time I was in graduate school. And when I graduated, jobs were not easy to find. I was in the job market for, I think, 4 consecutive years. And, 1 year I applied for 70 jobs. That was like, wow. And those were the days when you had to write it all out and send it in the mail. You couldn't just hit a button and say send. And it was a big deal. And I got 4 1-year jobs in a row. Now that's pretty demoralizing. It's like you're never settling in. They were in different cities. I was teaching in Philadelphia, then in Washington, D.C., then in Chester, Pennsylvania. And finally, I ended up at a job at a real research university, Michigan State University. But in the process, I found I taught at a elite private school. I taught at an open access public schools. I taught at a Catholic university, Georgetown. I taught at an open access private university where everybody was first generation. And then I taught at a land grant university, which was sort of started out as an agricultural school and turned into a university. And then I ended up at this, elite private institution at the end. And one way of looking at it is, wow, it's like a rags to riches story, climbing the ladder, working your way up. It's like a classic meritocratic story. But so I told the story 2 ways. The first one is like the one that makes you feel good. And the other one's the more that's a little realistic. And that is, I'm in the family business. Both of my grandfathers were professors. My parents grew up on a college campus. On my father's side, there were, I think, 4 generations of men who were Presbyterian ministers and professors. And the American model professors were often ministers because they were well educated and they worked for cheap. It was like a good deal all the way around. And my brother's a professor. And I ended up, I went to Harvard, which meant that it opened a lot of doors for me. Once I had a B plus, C minus, C plus, B minus average when I graduated from Harvard. But just the fact that I went there made me look smart, and people would hire me with very little qualifications otherwise. So it was, a story of one of those mixed stories. Not like I didn't do some work, but it was also that, you just got to look around and say, in some ways, it seemed like an obvious thing. When I talked to my brother once about his son, he said he's in his 30s. What's he doing? He said, well, he's just killing time until he goes to graduate school. He hasn't figured out yet that, this is what you do if you're a Labaree. You go to graduate school. And so, in that sense, it just felt like I was settling into something that was preordained, and I finally figured it out and was happy to enjoy all the consequences from it.
Is there? I like asking these questions because I like how people generally respond to the question. But I'm curious how you ended up at Stanford, and then I actually will go back to a question about. I believe the story that you're referring to. It's from your book called Being a Scholar. Have I got that right?
Yes, right.
Yeah, I'll make sure I put the details in the episode descriptor. But I'm going to actually ask you a few questions about that in a minute too. But I'll let you answer the question before about how you ended actually up at Stanford, or whether there's a story associated with that as well.
No, it was something. It's funny. I applied earlier to Stanford, and at a certain point, they were putting me off. I got the impression that I was being blown off, and so they'd say, "Well, we'll have to see." And so I started figuring out. I finally figured out what I was doing at Michigan State, and I figured this is a good place. I like it, and so they called me back and said, "Are you ready to come in for an interview?" And I said, "No." And I decided not to. I think I'm good where I am. And then about 3-4 years later, I decided, I think I'm ready to move. And I applied, and then, I actually got the job. But even there, what happened, they offered the job to somebody else, and he turned it down, and they decided to come to me. So
Okay.
I don't mind being, the first runner-up. And the Miss America pageant, they say, they always have a first runner-up. And if Miss America cannot fulfill her responsibilities, then you will take over. Well, I was the runner-up. So I always thank my friend John Zimmerman. Thank you for turning down the job, because, you gave me a nice opportunity there. I owe you one.
It's interesting because I think you mentioned in your book, which I referred to before, I'll read the whole thing, Being a Scholar, and then there's a colon, Reflections on Doctoral Study, Scholarly Writing and Academic Life. You mentioned, and you're the first person to actually acknowledge it, is luck, the role of luck in actually a lot of your kind of academic career. Can you talk to a little bit more about that? I actually was a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, it's like, you can't beat being lucky. It's a lot better than being smart. I remember Napoleon once said, "I need lucky generals." But it's, stuff would happen that just was kind of like magic. I decided to apply. I didn't think I wanted to be a professor, but I figured I was going to be a writer, and I was working for a newspaper. I hated it. I figured, well, they had a job over at the university, at the local community college, for teaching writing. And, I said, well, maybe I could do that. And then I noticed that they also had an opening in sociology, and my undergraduate degree was in sociology. So I applied to both, and it was the sociology guy who responded. So I became a sociologist by default. I kind of fell into it. And I only had a bachelor's degree. Teaching a community college in the U.S., you really need to have at least a master's. But the guy who hired me was the department chair, had gone to Harvard. So did I. I got the job. He figured, he could do it. So things like that just happened,
Yeah.
I mean, my first book, I ended up getting an editor who had been an editor of my advisor. And so she kind of watched out for me. And she ended up, when the book manuscript, I don't know if you know how books work, but typically you get a contract, and the contract means you can't sell it anywhere else, but they can still turn it down. It's the most one-sided contract in the world. So I got a contract. I submitted the manuscript. They sent it out for the review, and the reviewer hated it, just hated it. Wanted me to write a whole different kind of book. And so the editor said, could you write a response to that? And I did. She took the response to the board who makes the final decisions about publications. And she basically said, I'm I support the author on this, not the critic. And they published it. And that's the book that ended up getting me tenure, So it's like, she saved me. Like, wow. Thank you, Gladys.
Which book was that one?
That was The Making of an American High School.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to come back and ask you some questions about your books in a minute. But when I heard you kind of provide your narrative around your earlier career, so to speak, you mentioned a couple of times, and I want to ask you a question about, is it an American thing, or do you think it's indicative of higher ed or the appropriate institution that opens the doors? Or because, as you know intimately, being at the right institution, and you mentioned Harvard, can open doors for you. And I know you've written a fair bit around meritocracies and inequalities and so on and so forth. But I'll let you answer that first part of the question. And do you think that's just an American thing, and hence why you have this kind of clustering effect where they have the market cornered because they know, because it opens these doors, metaphorically, that there's nothing they need to do to advertise or promote themselves. They're going to get the cream of the crop, if you like. They're going to get the best students. They're going to kill themselves to go there, and you kind of have this perpetrating inequalities. Do you think this is just an American phenomenon?
It's a very American thing. Yeah. It is. Yeah. It's a very strange system. When I started working with colleagues in Europe and presenting some of my work about American universities, I actually ended up writing a book about it because I realized how strange the system was when I talked to my European colleagues. They'd say, you do what? How does that work? I mean, it's a radically decentralized system. It's one where the private colleges came first and the public ones came much later. And the private ones set the tone. And the tone was, these were independent institutions that didn't have a lot of support, had very little public funding behind them. So they had to hustle for money. They had to try to find students. They had to recruit faculty. They had to get donors, and they had to look for contracts and grants and all these other things. And so it was a kind of entrepreneurial institutions. There are no national universities in the U.S., for example. The only ones that exist are the military academies. Those are the only ones. It's all at state and local level. But as I said, the state institutions, the public ones, came later, and they followed the model. So the state funding is less than it is in most other universities. The proportion of the budget that comes from government is small. If you're at a major public research university, University of California, University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, maybe 10 or 15% of your entire budget comes from the government. The rest of it is coming from tuition. It's coming from grants. It's coming from donations. It's coming from contracts. It's coming from copyrights. It's coming from patents. It's coming from all kinds of side hustles that schools do. Yeah. And the bad part is it means that you're constantly struggling in a very competitive environment. But the good news is that it means it gives you a lot of autonomy. There is, even the state schools have relatively minor control coming from the government. You're an employee of the university, you're not an employee of the state. And you don't get a line item budget from the state. They just give you a block sum and you control your budget. You control what your tuition is, you control the hiring, you control everything. And so it's a market-based system, not a bureaucratic-based system. It's very much bottom-up rather than top-down. And like any market system, therefore, in a very competitive environment, you start creating hierarchies very quickly. And, the first colleges that were set up were places like Harvard and Yale and Penn, who were there first. They educated the elite. They got all the faculty. And everybody that came after them was playing catch up, And they all wanted to be like Harvard, but they couldn't quite make it. And so you get this model where everybody's hustling to move up the system if they can. And as the system expanded, it kept adding lower level institutions that were more and more accessible. And so you end up with a hierarchy that is really incredibly stratified. And it makes for a big difference. I mean, pay levels for faculty are sharply different at different levels of the system. For example, teaching loads are much lighter at the top than they are at the bottom. Life is better the farther up the system you are. And the model for students is to try to get into the most selective school you can. You want to get into the school that doesn't want to admit you. That's the one you want. And for faculty, the thing to do is you're trying to climb up into the good job. This is kind of the story I told in the first part of that thing about my own career. Start at the community college and end up at the top. It's a great all-American story, and it creates, the incentives are there that life is better if you can move up. And one of the interesting things about the phenomenon is that the most elite universities, the big research universities, have produced most of the PhDs, and most of the jobs are at the lower level of the system. So it creates a very interesting kind of status issue. The moment I used to tell the doctoral students, the moment you graduate, you're going to be downwardly mobile in a big way. They're not going to hire you at the level where you got your degree. They're going to hire you at the community college or at the open access state university that has basically all undergraduate programs. That's where you're going to be. And and I think in many ways that's a healthy thing. One thing, it means you get a lot of well-trained people at all levels of the system. But it also can create a certain degree of just unhappiness, like, I don't want to be here. I want to be over there. And so you have a lot of people that are lusting after a fancier letterhead. Oh, I want that letterhead. I want to put that on the signature of my email. I want to put that at the bottom of every PowerPoint slide. That's my identity. And one of the things about universities in the U.S. for students as well as faculty is that it's not just where you go to school, it's who you are. It's not just that I work here as a professor. No, I'm a Harvard professor. That's who I am.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's like, that's a big deal. It creates a lot of intense loyalty. And it's one of the reasons that I think people coming here and looking at a university are sort of surprised that like everybody's wearing the logo from the institution. They're wearing the brand on their hat, on their shirt, on their jacket. They're going to the football games like crazy. They're doing all the bookstore is not full of books. It's full of gear that has the brand of the university all on it, because the brand is you, and you want everybody to know it. I mean, you ask an American of college age, the first question you ask is, where do you go to school? And then it's like, where are you on the hierarchy here? I just want to know, what kind of person am I dealing with here? So it's a very strange system in that sense. And it has a lot of pathologies about it. And it creates a lot of psychic angst for both students and faculty because of, the kind of always lust for the next level up. If I could just get to the research university, I would be a happy person, you know.
Wow. That's, in a way, you are an American success story then. You've climbed all the way to the top of the ladder, right?
Yeah. Or I was born into it. You could play it either way.
Yeah.
And of course, I like the first version. It sounds a lot better to me.
It probably also explains why you mentioned before some of your students have this sense of entitlement. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I got in, you know, like, I mean, to get into a place like Stanford, they admit, I think it's 4% of the people who apply get admitted. So, boy, am I special. If I got in, you know, I'm special. And in some ways, admission is the big deal. You know, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg both dropped out of college, but where did they drop out of? They dropped out of Harvard. That's where they dropped out of. Once you get in, you've got it stamped on your head for the rest of your life. You don't need to graduate. I mean, it's like the admission is the hard part. The rest of it you can coast through. I mean, I coasted through my undergraduate degree without sweating too much. That's why my grade point average was so low. I was majoring in radical politics at the time. You know, it was my Marxist days, but so I didn't have a whole lot of time for, you know, writing papers and all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of the system encourages that. You know, it's like you've been elected to the club, and once I'm here, I look around at all the club members, and it's like, hey, aren't we special?
Yeah. It's clever because one of the first things I remember when I started going to America and visiting universities, you are right about your comments about, I was amazed by how many students wear the merchandise of their university. Like, it doesn't matter where you go, University of California, Berkeley, same thing. I go to Stanford, same thing. University of Chicago, same. I was actually genuinely surprised by everyone, even staff, wearing the gear.
Yeah.
And it's quite clever because you have this kind of, not only does it then identify you, but then it kind of reinforces that identity as you go forward, because in people, when they graduate, they still wear, the sweat top and the hat. And
they do.
You know, I find that fascinating. Do you think that's intentional or unintentional?
Well, I think it's a side effect that now turns into the main effect, because what it means is that if you get your students to identify with the university, that it's who I am, it's not where I go. And when I go on to the rest of my life, I'm always going to be a Michigan grad. People are going to know the Michigan thing. I'm going to have the sweatshirt that I wear all the time and so on. What that does for the university is it means this is a very grateful group of people. They're going to want to donate. And they do. And the reason that American universities have such huge endowments is that they're very good at mining that loyalty over the years. And they're very good at working out, let's get some sort of annual gift from each graduating class. And then the development officer, who's a very powerful person at an American university, development means fundraising. You start working with people who are more successful than others among your graduates, and you start encouraging them to do little gifts and then move them on to bigger things like endowing a professorship. And then one day they're going to build a whole building for you.
Yeah, well, that's a very common Stanford thing. When you walk around campus. Was it you who was telling me the story about you have to put a couple of billion to get a building named after you? Was that you who was telling me that story?
Yeah, it's like it's like the education school just built 2 new buildings. They took out the building that I was in, which was kind of a dump, and they ripped out the whole inside and redid it and built another one on next to it. And then they raised something around $100 million from donors to pay for this. And each building has a donor name on it, of course. And it's like magic. It works,
Mm.
I mean, every bench, every toilet has somebody's name on it in the place. It's like it's all been coming from donors. And so that's one of the reasons that the same is true at public universities. Huge amount of private donations go in, and lots of those buildings and professorships and park benches and stadiums all have somebody's name on it. And it's all because they feel like this is my place.
Mm.
For a donor, it's two things. One is gratitude. The other is it's very cool to have my name associated with a very prestigious place.
Yeah.
It helps my brand to be affiliated with that university brand in a very public way. And so it's kind of a win-win situation. The donor gets something good out of it. The university gets something good out of it. It's kind of amazingly effective machinery going on.
All right. Can we turn to some of your published works? I want to, if that's all right with you, I want to start with, I came across your work in The Trouble with Education or Ed Schools.
Right.
I found that one of my, like, I've read a fair bit of your work. I actually happen to like that book a lot. But for those who are listening, do you want to give a quick synopsis of that work? And then I've got a few questions for you around that piece of work.
I mean, it's interesting. My degree's in sociology, not in education. And my dissertation, which turned into my first book, was about a school. So when I started applying, I applied to jobs in sociology, but I also applied to jobs in education at the same time. And my first 2 or 3 jobs were in sociology departments, but my career didn't really take off until I got into education, because education had more opportunities and it's more positions than the others. So that was okay. Where were we going with that?
I was going to ask you some questions around the your work.
The Ed School book.
Yeah.
So when I got to Michigan State, this was my first Ed School job. Right, I've been in sociology departments before then, and so for me it was like being a participant observer in a foreign culture. I was like an anthropologist who's parachuted into some tribe somewhere, and it's like, boy, what are the norms here? How does this work? What's the status system? What's the whole rationale here? And I found it just fascinating. And, as a sociologist, it's fun to be in an organization and try to figure out what it's like. And being an outsider was helpful because none of it looked natural. One of the useful things for a social scientist is there's nothing worse for trying to understand something. If you feel it's natural, it couldn't be any other way, you're not going to figure out much at all about it. But when everything looks weird, then you ask questions you never would have otherwise. And so that's how I got that feeling about, wow, this is a really interesting place. And one of the things I was deciding is that it had a real status anxiety problem, where it was looked down on by the rest of the university. I'm not sure if that's true in Australia, but it's certainly
I think that's a fair observation, and I think it's an accurate observation. Yeah. And I think that's reasonably universal too, by the way.
Yeah, it's funny. I thought maybe it was just because I was at a big public university, but when I went to Stanford, I thought maybe it's going to be different here. My first day of class, I walked up to the education building, and Stanford students, for some reason, like to write in chalk on the sidewalk. And somebody had written in chalk in big letters a thing that said education building with an arrow pointing toward the education building. And they spelled it EDUKASHUN. I said, no respect at all, just no respect.
That's a
It's
good
like,
story.
okay.
That's a good story, that
So,
one. Yeah.
and so I ended up thinking about it. And it was really interesting because I realized that part of the thing that that made education lowbrow was that universities tend to value theory over practice in general, you know. And theory is not a big deal in professional schools in particular, and especially in education schools. And the fancy professional schools win out because they're dealing with a profession that itself is high status. Lawyers and doctors, come on.
Yeah,
Everybody
exactly.
wants their kid, son, or daughter to grow up to be a doctor or a lawyer. Not everybody's eager to say, "Oh, wow! If you really work hard, you can become a school teacher." It's
Yes.
like,
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, and so it's an interesting situation, so that you were sort of associated with what's seen as a second tier semi profession, and it's not even dealing with adults like other professions. It's dealing with kids. And, if you look at how pay works in the education system, the lowest paid people are the ones that teach the lowest age students. Preschool people get paid peanuts. High school gets paid more than elementary. College gets paid more than high school. Graduate school gets paid more than, the older the student, the better you are. And so we're stuck with, the clients are kids. The profession is not such a big deal. And we're not like real theoreticians where they think we're teaching blackboard erasing and lesson plans and, how to keep order in a classroom. And it's things that are
Correct.
not intellectually interesting. So
Yeah.
that's a problem. And to me, it's an interesting window into the university because it's showing what the university's values are in ways that are not necessarily flattering for the university. It's like people who are actually trying to deal with an institutional arena that's about as important as any you can imagine, the education system, and they don't get any respect for trying to do something about it and trying to make it good. It's like, wouldn't that be like a worthy thing to be spending your career on? It's like, instead of being, the comp lit scholar doing some obscure study about theories of cognition and it's like, this is, I felt like the kind of work that we're doing is not the work that gets respect, even though maybe it should.
Yeah, I think you make a very strong point. And I actually happen to agree with the point that you make, is that faculties of education, schools of education in universities are distinctly different. And you've provided a quite useful characterization around why they're viewed to be different and low status compared to other, kind of disciplines or fields. And I guess I got kind of two kind of questions. Well, I'll probably have more than two questions, but I'll go with the obvious one. And I know I asked this when I actually visited you. For those who are listening, David was good enough to take me to lunch on campus, so thank you. If I didn't say thank you, I'm saying thank you again. But anytime you turn, if you like, the camera or people's views back on yourself, like the discipline of education, did you get any blowback or criticism as a result because of that?
I did. It was interesting because part of it was I felt a little uncomfortable. I'd written a draft of the book, and I was thinking, the problem is I'm an insider in the sense that I'm teaching at an education school. I'm an outsider in the sense that I was never a school teacher myself. My degree was in social sciences, and I didn't want to be the voice, one of those carping voices saying, what do those people in education do anyway? Those people are nuts. And I had a colleague who gave me a great bit of advice. He said, when you're talking about people in education, use the first person plural, we. We in education are like this. It's not you, it's we. And that helped. I just so I tried as much as possible to embed myself in this and say, I'm an educator. I'm an ed school guy. This is what I do. When I'm talking about the problems with this institution, I'm talking about the problems of people like me. That's what I'm talking about. So I didn't. So I get around that thing of being the the cranky outsider voice pointing at the like so many people have written books like that saying what are those idiots doing in education. I didn't want to do that kind of thing. I wanted to like a sympathetic view, an insider view, not a one of those classic sort of
It certainly welcomes criticism because how you frame the critique determines essentially really how serious people will take it. So if it does come across as being whining and whinging, not only does it appear that you're criticizing yourself and your own field, and therefore your own field, it's unlikely anyone's going to take you seriously, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I just found it was a useful experience to go through. And as I said, it really set me up later to write a book about the university because I thought looking at the university from the bottom, which I was looking at it from the point of view of education, was very different from the kind typically people write books about the university from the very top. They're at the top of the system and they're looking around and say, isn't it great? And I think partly it's coming from having experienced all the other levels of the university system before getting there helped, but also being in a lowbrow section of a fancy university. I was in the right place, but in the wrong school. It's like, oops, you can never win, But that was they were both useful in trying to think about this institutional arena in a less self-satisfied mode than most books about higher ed do.
Yeah.
Would basically say, am I great? Are we great? All bow down before us. And that's an attitude that's gotten universities into a lot of trouble in this country in particular, that sort of snobby approach to everybody else. I mean, one of the biggest divides in American politics right now is between people who went to college and those who didn't. And the ones who didn't go to college are feeling tired of being preached at by the fancy pants that got the fancy education, and somehow they don't get any respect for the very serious work they do. And if you don't have a college degree and work in a nice, clean office, you're not a serious member of the economic community. That's a very unhealthy way to do things. And unfortunately, one of the side effects of schooling has been that it creates those kinds of hierarchy of status. And there was a great analysis I read of a guy who did a lot of focus groups with Republicans and Democrats recently, trying to understand their feelings about the two parties. And what they tended to agree on was that Republicans are crazy and Democrats are preachy. And the one woman said, I pick crazy over preachy. I don't like somebody preaching at me and looking down at me. And that's what I feel every time one of those university educated people starts telling me about the fact that I have to call Latinos Latinx because that's the way we do things here. And I have to use the right language, and and I'm suspected of being racist just because of who I am, because I'm not one of the the ultra educated who are now surpassed all those sorts
Yeah.
of distinctions.
That characterization is really of the intellectual elite. They're all the key decision makers. They're all the ones who, if you like, pushing certain kind of ideologies on others. So you can understand how that preachiness that people would feel is actually a legitimate feeling, telling us what language to use. You can understand how that could be, well, I'm not going to say offensive, but problematic. Let's say problematic.
Well, you notice something that really interesting that happened during COVID was that we all discovered a new terminology, which is essential workers. Essential workers were ones that had to go out of the house and do stuff, even though everybody else was supposed to be sheltering in place. And guess what? They weren't people like us. We were not essential. We could work from home and nobody would miss us. But if you're a cop, a fireman, a doctor, a nurse, an emergency worker, a plumber, an electrician, like they can't function without you, So it's like, oh, guess what? These people that don't have fancy degrees are really making a big contribution out there. It's like, oops, but as soon as COVID disappeared, that momentary thing of where we used to applaud all the public service workers that were out there in the street, we forgot about that now. Now it's down on them because they weren't smart enough to go to college.
Yeah, it's interesting. You reckon that was a catalyst, COVID-19. It shone a light on the importance of, well, I'll use the terminology we're talking about, the essential workers, right? So that's interesting. I find we won't go down the rabbit hole of American politics too far, but
please don't.
I might circle back. I want to ask you a little bit about that low status problem of faculties of education, schools of education, and universities. I actually think you are correct in making that observation. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, is that self-inflicted, or is there anything that they can proactively do to change that? Because I completely agree that faculties of education, schools of education, departments of education in higher ed or universities are distinctly different. You've already given a characterization how there's a strong emphasis on like a professional bent, like practice, professional experience, so on and so forth. But yet you contrast that with law and medicine, which are high prestige and equally professionally orientated.
Right.
And so I'm just interested in what could be done about it. Like, is it schools of education are just perpetually damned now as a result of it, or is this self-inflicted? Like, is this self-inflicted on schools of education who just think like this? Or I'm just interested in your thoughts here in terms of, like, can anything be done about it? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is I think a lot of it is structural and not self-inflicted. But for reasons that we've been describing. But some of it is, I mean, I was sort of, there's a kind of anti-intellectual element that runs through education schools.
Yes.
That I found irritating. That you can't, you need to be focusing on practical issues. You can't step back and say, why is this happening? How can we explain this? What are the sort of big issues here? And I found my own, I don't know if you've probably figured this out yourself. When you're teaching in a place for a while, you sort of have to figure out, what's my role here? What do I do that I think I'd like to do and I'm pretty good at, that they need, that other people aren't doing? And I realized that other people were not doing, big picture stuff. They were doing, let's focus on making the best reading teacher we can.
Mm.
And they weren't focused on broader theoretical understandings of like how schools work, how they evolved over time, what are the sort of tensions within them, and that was something students were interested in. I thought was an important thing to do. It's where my interest was,
Mm.
but the fact that that was such a big hole to fill was not a compliment for the institution. That maybe it doesn't attract people who are interested in things like that, or maybe it simply socializes people into a mode of operation that's a little less than intellectually stimulating.
No, that's excellent. Thank you for actually saying something that I also have experienced and observed myself. I think that anti-intellectual dimension is, I've encountered it, and I've worked at a number of different universities, and you know this. I've encountered that wherever I've gone, and funny enough, even when I visited other universities as well. And I find that absolutely fascinating, but also at the same time, something that has kind of hit me with a bit of a sledgehammer a little bit, as in like it's so blatantly obvious to me, but yet part of the problem. It's kind of, and I can't help but feel that that's part of the issue, isn't it? But this is not about what I think. I'm just interested in your thoughts on whether that can be addressed or not. I mean, is this just a bridge too far for faculties and schools of education in universities, or is it just part and parcel of what it means to be a faculty and school of education in higher ed?
I don't know. I mean, I think the problem in education that I saw is that when you move away from the practical, it doesn't move into an intellectually rigorous and engaged intellectual community. It turns more into an ideological community. I'm not sure if wokeness was a big thing in Australia, but it was huge in the US. And
oh, no, it still is today. Yeah.
It's particularly in the humanities, and in some ways the worst places for it are places like education. And it's focused on, that everything, when you step back from the specifics, everything comes down to identity politics. It comes down to what your race is, which of the 27 possible genders you affiliate with, and what side you're on in the settler colonialist issue. We both are, of course, live in settler colonialist settings, so there's plenty of things, and we both happen to be white. So, as a white settler colonialist, you have so much to apologize for. Oh, and being cisgender on top of it. It's like, oh my God, where do I start? Woe is me. And so there's that I found really irritating without any sort of intellectual pushback against it. Let me give you an example of this. I just came back from a meeting of the National Academy of Education in Washington. It's a group of sort of like senior people who've been elected to the club of the National Academy, and they have their annual meeting where we pat each other on the back and say, aren't we great? And so it was my first time going to this, and, parts of it were nice. It's like, hey, it's nice to be part of the club. But part of it was really depressing. And that was that I found that here we are, the highest levels of the education academic community in the country, and nobody was willing to disagree on major issues. There was this stultifying consensus about every broader issue in the field.
Wow.
Let me give you an example. So One of the things that's happening right now with in the Trump administration is that they've had this crackdown on diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, which was huge in education schools, very big. And I found really annoying the way it played out. And so, but of course, the Trump administration has gone way too far. And now they're saying basically, if you want to apply for a grant, you can't use the word diversity, you can't use the word equity, you can't use the word race, you can't talk about inclusion. It's like, so it's like, that's crazy. So everybody was whining about that. It's like, I can't do that. I can't do that. And so I just sort of raised my hand and said, we started that. I mean, we were policing language long before Trump started policing language.
Yeah.
We were telling people you couldn't use the word slave. You had to say enslaved person. You couldn't say somebody was Latino or Latina. You had to say Latinx, even though nobody who's Latino or Latina ever used that term and consider it sort of reprehensible, but it seemed to be political.
Yeah.
You can't say somebody's disabled. They are differently abled. And you always have to be apologizing for not being transsexual and for, your whiteness and your colonial, settler colonialist heritage. And so that kind of thing is just, it's rampant. And, in lieu of intellectual exchange and theoretical exploration, we seem to have this thing where we are preaching to each other about who's right. I mean, I was having trouble in the last couple of years teaching with doctoral students in particular, teaching having whole class and conversations, because somebody in the room would shut down everybody else by making a statement about how this my people don't think this way, and this is an attack on indigenous populations, or that's a racist position. And students would tell me afterwards, it's like I couldn't say anything. You can't argue with it because you're racist or sexist if you do. And how can you have a discussion at a university if you can shut people down every time they disagree with you by labeling it as something that's personally reprehensible? It's like, wow.
With great difficulty.
I wanted to get out at that point. I was like, okay, they offered me a buyout. I said, thank you. I'm gone.
Yeah, I understand. I might, if it's all right with you, I want to ask a few kind of broad type questions, but
I'm going to need to get going soon, by the way.
Yeah, and we're running out of time too. So I want to just ask you a couple of things. So first of all, because we're talking about your publications, and you've written quite a number of publications, and I'll make sure we list your publications in the episode descriptor so people can refer to those and check them out if they want to.
They're attractively priced and on Amazon also.
Yeah, sure. I like it. Out of everything that you've written, which is your favorite? Like, what's your favorite piece of work?
The latest thing I do is my most interesting one.
Okay. Really? Purely because it's the most recent, or just because?
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, I don't know. It's like I've learned to sort of not dwell on stuff and say whatever I'm working on now seems to be fun, know, sure. And that's good. And one of the things I've enjoyed is doing this blog that I do now. I post on my blog twice a week. I've been doing it for 5 years now, ever since graduation. Retirement. It's not graduation. It's retirement. Anyway.
Well, hopefully you can blog about the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been kind of fun to go back and revisit things that I've done in the past. Say, wow, actually, that's kind of fun. I would kind of rediscover things that I'd done back then. It's kind of reassuring that I haven't been a complete idiot all my life, and that things that I did early in my career were not necessarily embarrassing to look at later, and
Yeah.
that's nice. It's sort of so that's been fun, and lately I've discovered self-publishing, which you can do when you retire because you don't have to worry about getting a fancy university press to put out your book. Um, I could just self-publish through Amazon, and I put out 3 books in 3 years, uh, which the first is the one you were talking about, being a scholar.
Mm.
But I'm just collecting things that I've done around a particular theme and putting it out. I think I'll do one more book like that. But that's nice. It's a way of sort of revisiting, reconsidering, reassembling ideas from the past and saying there may be still some legs in this story, and maybe it'd be useful to put them out. So,
Yeah. Do you want to give a plug to those books, your most recent books?
yeah, the 3 most recent one, Being a Scholar, was the first, which is about the graduate school scholarship and writing and the academy.
Mm-hmm.
The second is called The Ironies of Schooling, which is about the nature of the school system and some of the things we've been talking about today. The fact that the consequences of schooling are bad as well as good. And it pays to have a sense of irony when you're approaching schooling, because there are places that promote equality and inequality at exactly the same time. And they somehow manage to do all that within the same institution without exploding. And the third one is called The Emergent Genius of American Higher Education, which is talking about this strange system of higher ed that the U.S. developed over the years that we've just been talking about. So those are the 3.
Oh, that's great. No, thanks for doing that. It's very useful. Because we're running out of time, I wanted to ask you, and I like to ask this question as my last kind of question, and I'm putting you a bit on the spot here, so you can answer it however you like. But if I asked you 3 books that you would recommend people to read or get their hands on, you could. You've now listed. You could argue you could list your 3 books that you mentioned.
No. Oh, no.
Just 3 books in general that you would recommend, and why?
Wow. Yeah, lots of them I can think of. Philip Jackson's Life in Classrooms is a stunning book. It's published in the 70s. The opening chapter is one of my favorite pieces of academic writing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's about, it's looking about what happens in school. It's a great unpacking of what it feels like from the student's point of view as opposed to the adult's point of view. Another one I love is by James Scott called Seeing Like a State. He's an anthropologist and a political scientist, which is an interesting combination. So he's both high theory and feet on the ground at the same time. And he's looking at how it is that when you try to impose order on an organic setting on the ground, like the king trying to impose an order on France, for example, you make all kinds of, you mess everything up, because the ecology on the ground depends on local knowledge. And when you try to impose epistemic knowledge on it, it collapses. And that's a great way to think about school reform, where people sitting in some suite in the state capitol or the federal capitol say, well, schools ought to be doing this. And, schooling happens in individual classrooms out there, and it's messy. And you have to know what you're doing. And this trying to impose some order from above on it is going to destroy the local ecology that actually makes education happen. So those are 2 I would strongly recommend.
Yes. Excellent. No, that's great. I appreciate it. I had sprung that question on you a little bit, but I like your response. Sometimes the best responses are just the natural ones. So I'll make sure we list those also on the episode descriptor. But and I guess my last question I want to ask you, do you think we've missed anything?
No, we've done great. This has been so much fun.
Excellent. Well, I want
I
to take this
enjoy our
opportunity.
conversations. I hope we keep it up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank you, David, for joining me. I appreciate it. And I just want to say to anyone who's listening, make sure you check out some of David's books if you get a chance. They're all available on different kind of platforms. You've already mentioned Amazon, and they're easy to access too, by the way. And like David's already said, they're reasonably priced as well.
Can I mention one thing too?
Sure.
If they go to my blog and they can find it, it's just davidlabaree.com. There's a link on there for readings, and I have a document you can download which has links to copies of all of the articles and book chapters I've ever written.
Okay, sure, that's very useful.
It's free. You can just click on it, boom, it takes you to a Google Drive.
Okay,
so
excellent.
It's a nice way of getting access to stuff without having to figure out where to find it somewhere else.
Yeah, definitely make sure we put that in the episode descriptor, definitely, for sure. Well, we might leave it there, but again, thank you, David, for your time. And,
thank you.
And I want to say to those who've been listening, thank you for tuning in. Bye for now.